So I'll start by mentioning John Vervaeke. John Vervaeke is this psychologist at the University of Toronto. He did a YouTube course, or not course, but lecture series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I think I watched the first 20 episodes. But one thing he says early on in that series is that in his view, the Axial Age is the most significant development with respect to human psychotechnologies, to use his term, since the Upper Paleolithic transition, which is to say the emergence of behavioral modernity, which refers to a number of things which you could probably say more about than I could, but I think, abstract thinking, really sophisticated tool making, maybe even modern language, although I don't know if that's part of behavioral modernity. And I should have mentioned that John Pfeiffer's creative explosion is an important part of the Upper Paleolithic transition, the explosion of art and ritualistic religion that John Pfeiffer analyzed in that book. That's kind of right smack in the middle of the Upper Paleolithic transition, and it's part of this suite of behaviors and new technologies and psychotechnologies that people refer to as behavioral modernity. Okay, so now why am I saying all this? Well, I thought it was interesting. So for Vervaeke, you have the Upper Paleolithic transition, and then the next major thing that happens is the Axial Age. And that reminds me of Gebser, only in the sense that Gebser thinks the most important shift or mutation following the development of mythological thinking is the development of philosophy or the mental consciousness structure. That's coincident with the second generation of civilization. So, you and I have been talking a lot about the birth of civilization, but for both Vervaeke and for Gebser, really, the really critical shift is not the birth of civilization. It's the development of the mental consciousness structure or philosophical thinking in the second generation of civilization. And before that, the big shift is from magical to mythological. Now, I think I understand fairly well what the Axial Age is. I've read Jaspers, and I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the thinkers and sages who represent the coming of the Axial Age. That is Lao Tzu, Confucius, the Buddha, Zarathustra, the pre-Socratic philosophers, the Hebrew Bible, etc. So I'm fairly clear on what the birth of the mental consciousness structure, i.e., the Axial Age, is. But I realized I don't really know when the birth of the mythological consciousness structure occurred.
I see. Okay.
Right. So Gebser, has these strata of human consciousness. He doesn't really like to think of it chronologically, I think, but just that human consciousness has multiple layers. The deepest layer or stratum would be the archaic, followed by the magical, followed by the mythical, followed by the mental, for him, followed by the integral. Mythical to mental, I feel like I have a decent handle on that, but magical to mythical, especially with respect to when that occurred, I don't really know what the answer is. Like, how long has mythological thinking been around? So that's really what I wanted to talk to you about. And then we could talk a little bit about some related topics, but let me stop there and kind of get your initial reaction to what I said.
Sure. I think it's important to, so Gebser makes this distinction between magical and mythical, but it's not by magical. He doesn't mean there were no myths around. It's not that cut and dried, because myth making probably goes back, actually, my guess is probably the lower Paleolithic, well back. Maybe not to the Australopithecines, but by the time of Homo habilis, I think, who's the first to start making tools. Once you get that tool making part of the brain active, I think that it's connected to speech centers as well. And I think that language is probably coming in right about there. And almost the moment language comes into being, there's going to be little tiny stories that are being told about so-and-so who went off into the woods and found this weird animal and brought it back, and then something weird happened to him. Or more to the point, they might be doing narratives of, shamans who are going off and having vision quests. Who knows when that comes into being in a concrete way? It's definitely there in the Upper Paleolithic, because we have all kinds of shaman burials. Burial of the dead, though, does not become common until almost, about 100,000 years ago. So it is in the Lower Paleolithic. So it's about 50,000 years before it. in Palestine, where the earliest burials occur. So if they're already thinking in that way about that we have to bury our dead, and not only bury the dead, but put them in a fetal posture, as at the cave of at Kafse, bury them in a fetal posture, they're already thinking mythologically, because that's an analogy from womb to tomb. The fetus, he's going to have a new body at some point. He'll be reborn, obviously. So clearly they are thinking mythologically there. That's an inference, but it's a pretty good one. It may not be good enough for academics, but it's good enough for folks like me. So they're telling stories, and probably in the during the creative explosion, with Pfeiffer's creative explosion, when we've got art all over the walls and sculpture and new technologies and all that's coming into being, stories are going to be in there, absolutely, 100%. There's not even a doubt about that, and anybody who does doubt it is not thinking straight. Those people were sitting around fires entertaining each other. There's not a doubt of that. And probably some of those stories, because of the conservatism of Aboriginal man, have survived amongst Native Americans. And this was Joseph Campbell's idea in the Historical Atlas of World Mythology, when he's surveying all the Native American myths and looking at the hunting myths, which come down from the north. The northern zone of the U.S. is the sort of hunter zone, and the southern zone becomes the agrarian zone. But you can find in a lot of those myths, amongst such as amongst the Blackfeet Indians, a lot of hunting myths that sound pretty genuine, that may have been preserved from way, way back, God knows how far. So it's there and it's going on. But by magical consciousness structure, though, Gebser means that the whole consciousness has a sort of unitary point-like connectedness. All things are connected by sympathetic magic. If you want to make something happen over there, you have to do something over here that either contains by the principle of contagious magic, a lock of someone's hair, let's say, to put spells on them, or imitative magic, when you're drawing a picture of an animal and you throw a spear at it and then go out and hunt the animal and bring it back with the spear wound in the exact spot. So those are the two forms of magic that Fraser describes in the Golden Bough: imitative and or sympathetic and contagious magic. So that magical structure is really, it's a structure that bonds the tribe together. We can imagine these tribes of probably no more than 30 people, all mostly very young. Life expectancy is about 30. The shamans may live longer because they're so revered and they're given so many privileges and so forth. They probably live longer, and they probably, a long-lived shaman would be somebody who was 40, 45 years of age, and people were probably in awe of this guy. But the mythical consciousness structure, whereby the whole society is organized by myths, and the magical practices are sort of fading off into the background, maybe as shamans do, because shamans also fade in the background once we move into the agrarian Neolithic period, around 12,000 BC for the pre-Pottery Neolithic A, which starts getting up and running. That's the Mesolithic. PPN A is roughly 10,000 to 8,000, just to round it off and make it easy to remember. The dates are not that simple. And 8,000 to 6,000 for the pre-Pottery Neolithic B. But already during the PPN A, shamans are being devalued. They're being moved out of the way. Priestly types are probably coming forward now to take the place of shamans. So it is a change of consciousness. It's now agrarian and settled. And I think Gebser says that the mythical consciousness starts coming in during the Neolithic with the mother goddess cults. And they're probably telling myths that are absolutely constitutive of the formation of the society, why our villages are egg-shaped, because they're eggs of a giant bird goddess, maybe, or whatever the myth happens to be. Now it is thoroughly mythical, it's settled, and it's locked into place, and magic has either devolved into black magic and spell casting, or it's just regarded as, old-fashioned. That's what people used to do. We now have a priestly society organized and run by priests who inherit their offices. They don't have to go on individualistic vision quests. So this is a different consciousness that's coming in. And then by the time you get to the Bronze Age, 3500 BC, you get the big myths about the separation of the world parents, where the Sky Father and the Earth Mother separate. The whole world is thought of as a flat disk resting on an amniotic uteromorphic ocean surrounding it. When I think of the mythical consciousness, I'll be honest and think I normally think that it just for practical reasons, that it's identical with the Bronze Age and the birth of high civilization, because the myths now aren't just organizing villages, they have to organize entire cities. So it's a big deal now. And they have a central ziggurat and everyone goes up it, or whoever's in the procession, to meet the gods when they come down. But technically, Gebser does, because I checked this and went back through it, and he does say that it starts coming in about the middle of the Neolithic with the goddess cults.
So one point you're making is that, at least in your view, Homo sapiens have been telling stories from the beginning of the existence of our species and before.
I mean, once language is up and running, then we have storytelling.
Well, yeah,
but in fact, further than language.
Right. So language is a precondition of story, but at the same time, story is going to come along for the ride almost immediately. So, right. So the development of language and the development of story are probably right around the same time. Of course, then we would have to ask ourselves, okay, what exactly do we mean by language? Are there different levels of language? How long has what you and I are doing, the language faculty that you and I are exercising, how long has that been around? But I want to bracket that for a second. So I think the point you were making, though, is that storytelling goes back a long way, definitely before the Neolithic, probably before the Upper Paleolithic. And in that sense, at least, myths have been with us for a long time. And if you define myth as just a story with a kind of moral or a story with some kind of message that is useful or something like that, then myth goes back a long time. On the other hand, if you think myth is fundamentally about the creation of gods that are separate from nature itself, that would be a different definition. That would be a more specific definition, and that would be more consistent with the mythological consciousness structure coming online during the Neolithic period.
There is a shift in my studies of the Neolithic and the transition to the rise of high civilization. We have this Pottery Neolithic that then is the third phase after PPN A, PPN B, and then we have the Pottery Neolithic, about 6,500. And during the Pottery Neolithic, as Mary Sedegast remarks in her studies in Plato Prehistorian, when she's talking about this, there's a shift away from the ancestors. So the ancestor cults already in the Pottery Neolithic are dropping out. And we know this because skull worship is part of the ancestor cults. And skull worship has just been going on during that whole period there, from 10,000 down to the Neanderthals also did have some practices of it, but it really kicks in during places like Chaionu, 8,000 BC, where we find huge caches of skulls lined up everywhere and traces of obsidian or flint knives with human blood on them. Obviously, they're practicing human sacrifice there. And at the same time, the goddess worship is coming into being, but it's still very strongly oriented to the dead, to the ancestors. By the time of the Pottery Neolithic, that seems to be falling away in most places, except in the Halafian regions in the Taurus Mountains. They're sort of conservators of the cults, but they fall away, and we start getting what Mary Sedegast calls pyrotechnologies. That is to say, cremation of the dead actually starts coming in, which is a surprise because it used to be thought that the Indo-Aryans or Indo-Europeans introduced that. Actually, it goes back into the Pottery Neolithic, along with the larger kilns, two-chambered kilns for the firing of very sophisticated pottery, Halafian and Samaran pottery. Samaran down on the Sumerian plain there, the alluvial plain, and the Halafians in the north. And it looks like the ancestors are dropping out, so that by the time we get to the rise of high civilization, and I still think the date should be roughly 3,500 BC, right in there with these cities coming into being. The shift has shifted to the sky and to the study of the planets and the identification of the gods with the stars. And so you could say, okay, well, now this is the mythical consciousness structure proper. And then perhaps if that's the case, we would need to revise Gebser's model. And really, if I was doing this, that's where I would draw the line with the rise of these gods that are no longer the ancestral dead, and that therefore sort of clear the way for a lot of innovations which start coming in. New forms of technology, the wheel comes in, new forms of burial, new forms of metallurgy, such as the creation of bronze and so forth. And all of that starts coming in, another great creative explosion starts coming in once the ancestral dead are out of the way, and we're no longer just imitating the dead, that mimesis is just based on the past. Now they're gone, and there's a window open where we have gods who are now patrons of these new technologies, whereas the ancestors were not.
Yeah, okay, this is really helpful too, right? Because Campbell, it's the historical atlas of world mythology and primitive mythology. So he's really arguing that the hunter-gatherers, the foraging societies, did have their own kind of mythology. But if we define mythology as the creation of gods, then it really has to be the Neolithic with the creation of the mother goddess. If we define it even more specifically as really the cleaving of nature from the heavens, then it would have to be more the Bronze Age and coincident with the birth of civilization. And yeah, I mean, what you're describing with respect to the heavens, it's Campbell's celestial lights. So Campbell, has his own way of talking about all these phases, right? So the animal powers, and then the seated earth, the mother goddess, and then the celestial lights, which is the celestial pantheons of the Bronze Age civilizations. Okay, and I mean, maybe it's almost just a semantic question, what you choose to call mythology and what you don't. It sounds though like Gebser thinks that it's really the invention of gods or goddesses that marks. So he would not call
Gebser and Campbell differ in that respect.
Right.
Absolutely. That's a good point.
Yeah. And right. So Gebser might say that the stories that the Paleolithic societies told, about the buffalo, for example, that's not mythology yet. That's still maybe a kind of magical animism, the spirit of the buffalo, or, something like that.
For Gebser, yeah.
Yeah, for Gebser, right. Okay. Okay, and just to be clear, we've talked about this a little before, although not in depth. So you think that James Fraser's shift from magic to religion is roughly synonymous with Gebser's shift from magical to mythical?
I'm not 100% sure, but Gebser might have borrowed it from Fraser. I'm not sure that whether Gebser read Fraser or not. That would have to be, we'd have to look that up, but it is suspiciously similar, where Fraser says the religious history has moved from the magical phase to a religious phase to the science phase, and the science outmodes the previous two phases. It's unclear to me actually where. And Campbell, I remember him giving a lecture about Fraser's magical structure and saying, taking this same very issue and saying, well, Gebser or Fraser says we have religion beginning with magic, and then it becomes formalized with priests. And he really means high civilization when he says religion, and the big religions that start coming in with priests and so forth. But Campbell, I remember giving this lecture criticizing Fraser in that distinction, because he would say the same thing about Gebser, saying, well, it's not really clear, with the magical, what is magical and what isn't. Is the magical within the religious magical still, or what? Because stories are going on in both cases for Campbell. So anytime you have storytelling at all, the mythical structure is activated, as far as Campbell is concerned.
As far as Campbell's
mythical structure, now, remember too, where the mythical structure has come from is Jung's collective unconscious. That's where Gebser has borrowed it. It's just that what Gebser doesn't like is the collective unconscious is just a junk heap of discarded signifiers that Jung just sort of tosses all the religious figures into. And Gebser's like, no. This needs to be organized and ordered into strata, into phases. You can't just lump everything in there and call it the collective unconscious. But when he says mythical consciousness structure, he is really talking about the collective unconscious, although the magical is like, for Gebser, a lower level of it.
I seem to remember that Fraser, like his distinction between magic and religion is still pretty influential, and he's pretty dismissive of magic, which maybe one could criticize, but he views it as faulty reasoning, where it's an attempt to control nature according to the fallacy that by messing with nature here, you can affect it over here. And the innovation with religion is you actually, in order to influence your own life, appeal to spiritual beings, that is gods. Right. So at least definitionally, that's pretty similar to what I was saying earlier about mythology really being about the creation of gods, the mother goddess, and you appeal to the mother goddess, you propitiate her.
It's not comfortable though, because to say that really, to identify the gods with mythology, because mythology has been going on for so long whenever the people have been telling stories. So what else do you call that? The storytelling that went on in the Paleolithic. It's got to be some form of mythology. And then we have all these slippery words that we're using. I remember Campbell saying too, myths are other people's religions.
Right.
So where do you draw the line? Is it the case that Christianity is religion and all paganism is myth? Because that wasn't true and Christianity is. So,
Yeah.
because a
Well,
lot of people took objection to Campbell putting Christianity in
yeah.
the same boat with all these other myths and calling Christianity myths. Oh, Christianity's not myths. It's true. Everything in it is true. So a lot of scholars objected to that. And Campbell's like, no, it's a mythical system. The Gospels are myths, just like all this other stuff. It's all mythology. So Campbell uses the term myth in a very broad band. He
Yes.
doesn't really, when he makes these epochs, unlike Gebser, he doesn't really ever say that myth is less in one epoch than it is in another, because for Campbell, it's always there.
What's important to understand is that story has been with us more or less from the beginning. The nature of the story has changed in important ways that map on fairly well to economic life, we might say material life. That is going from hunting and gathering to horticultural to agrarian, Bronze Age, et cetera.
We should remark too, though, now that I'm thinking about it, that it isn't just Campbell who puts the Judeo-Christian world into the basket with myths. Mircea Eliade does the exact same thing. And I believe Eliade remained a Christian, if I'm not mistaken, and a thoroughgoing academic, a respectable academic. But he was doing the same exact thing too. If you read his history of religious ideas, he goes through all Christianity in there as well, and he refers to all of that as mythology also. So he was doing it in the academic world, Campbell in the popular world.
Yeah.
It was part of that generation of the discovery of myth. Oh, we've solved all the religious problems now. In the whole Eranos generation of starting with Jung, going down through Eliade and Campbell, everything is myth, 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 myth. It's probably not that way anymore. I'm out of touch with the field. Recently, it probably isn't that way anymore. It's probably reverted back into that distinction between you can't call the Bible myths. That's a different world. That's religion. Everything else is myth. It is the case, though, that the Bible, the biblical myths are probably more so than any other tradition, particularly historical.
Yeah.
In their accent and their emphasis. The Hebrews remembered everything that happened to them. They had an intensely historical consciousness. So they are, if we were to look at it from their point of view, the writers of the various texts that were edited together in the Bible, they were telling their own history. For them, it wasn't myth. This was history. This is us as a people. This is the history as we remember it. That includes myths in there, but they wouldn't consider them myths. They would just be considered part of the Hebrew history. So that may be one of the reasons why that distinction is made. These aren't myths like other people's are.
I don't think we know the answer to this question, but the thing you and I are doing, language, it's one of the deepest faculties and capacities of human beings. And I'm very curious to know how long human beings have been capable of doing what you and I are doing. In other words, how far back in history do you have to go? Like if we went back 150,000 years and just took a baby and put them in America in 2023, would they grow up capable of doing what you and I are doing right now? Like learning this language and speaking it roughly as well, becoming fluent in any human language. I don't think we really know the answer to that question. One thing that I have learned in the brief amount of research I've done on this is that, first of all, linguists and others don't really agree on when this faculty or capacity developed, but most think it was between 50,000 and 150,000 years ago. So, and it might have been shortly before the Upper Paleolithic transition. Like it might have been 60,000 BC, or just, it's like 10,000 years before behavioral modernity comes in. There's a debate between two theses, the continuity thesis and the discontinuity thesis. The discontinuity thesis, and I think Noam Chomsky is actually a proponent of this, is that the human language faculty is sort of just a mutation out of nowhere. It's not that human beings and hominids kind of slowly developed language over hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. And what you and I are doing is simply the most recent iteration, which would be the continuity thesis. But I think most linguists do believe in the continuity thesis, not the discontinuity thesis. Anyway, this doesn't seem plausible to me, but let's just posit for the sake of argument that the modern language faculty was a mutation that came online 60,000 years ago, well, then I think it would follow that we didn't have story 100,000 years ago.
I totally disagree with that. As far as these guys, I don't know, you're relaying, if this is your point of view, you're relaying their point of view. But either way, it's a point of view that I don't find tenable, because it's a little bit like saying that modern Homo sapiens, I guess they're pushing them back to like 200,000 years ago now, coming out of East Africa, are the true originators. There are heroes. They're the true originators of language. They're truly human. You start getting slightly racist overtones in here. The Neanderthals have been deontologized, and back when I was studying them and reading all kinds of books like Ian Tattersall and guys like this who deontologized them as less than human. And this extends on into, the Clan of the Cave Bear, with Gene Al portraying Neanderthals as not being able to talk, and they're using sign language. Total bullshit. That's totally wrong, because you can't make a tool without language. You have to be able to look at it, examine it, flip it over. You might ask your companion, what do you think about it? There has to be language, or there's no point in bringing a tool. I don't see how you can bring tools into being without that part of the brain being able to form some kind of basic concepts. Mm-hmm. It's just that words are going to be very concrete, not abstract. Words for rock, water, blood, danger. That's going to be one of the first words ever invented. Danger. There's a radio over there. I see it going back to Homo habilis. I really do.
I think there's a wide spectrum of opinion. I did read that some trace the development of language back to Homo habilis, and others to...
I would agree with that thesis right there.
And some to the more recent Homo heidelbergensis, which did give rise to both Neanderthals and sapiens. So I think there are a lot of people in that community who agree with you. Okay, here's just one random question. Astrology and alchemy, where do they fit into the magical, mythical distinction in your view?
Well, I don't think you can have astrology without some kind of basic writing, because there has to be some way, because astrology, for it to work, depends on an ephemeris. And an ephemeris is a careful catalog, very careful, longitude, latitude, where everything is at. That's how you keep track of where the stars were and where they are now. And that presupposes writing. So I see astrology coming in as part of that way of the celestial lights with the Bronze Age. I don't think that it can go back that much further. But although I do think that earlier forms of astrology, like creating constellations, Michael Rappengluck is a guy who wrote a book called Heaven Maps. It hasn't been translated, so I'm translating it. Heaven Maps of the Ice Age, or Celestial Maps of the Ice Age is probably how it would be translated, where he goes into the caves and even finds some of these. He thinks that the bull at Lascaux may actually be Taurus, and that there may be little dots on there that represent the Pleiades. And he goes through and he looks at a number of these images in the Paleolithic caves, especially Lascaux, and thinks that these are early proto-constellations. So identifying constellations probably goes back into the Paleolithic, but astrology as we know it, in the complicated form where you have to know what transits are, what aspects are, and all of that kind of stuff really does presuppose writing.
The one sense in which both astrology and alchemy seem to me to have at least a vestige of magical thinking, which is not a critique, is that in astrology, the basic idea is that what's happening over there with the stars affects here. In other words, it's the point-like unity. It's all biosphere.
Connected. Right? Yeah. It's like a vestige or a survival of the magical, but it's a much more sophisticated version of it,
As is alchemy. As is
alchemy too, with the not the Arabs. It was invented in Alexandria by Greeks, actually, and the Arabs later took it over. But it comes out of Egyptian Alexandria. And the reason for why alchemy originates in Greek Alexandria under the Ptolemies is because it's really based on Egyptian knowledge of techniques, that a very sophisticated technological knowledge combined with Greek philosophical mentality. And you bring those two together in Alexandria once the Greeks have conquered it, and alchemy comes out of that.
Well, that actually segues nicely into the last set of issues I wanted to ask you about, because I just want to concretize this a little bit. So let me just mention a few things and you can kind of run with them in the direction you see fit. So one thing you've said in conversations we've had in the past is that Egypt was more, it still had more of a foot in the magical consciousness structure than Mesopotamia did, right? But
Absolutely.
Mesopotamia kind of cleaved from it more clearly, whereas Egypt kept one foot in it. So actually, let's just start there. Can you elaborate a little bit? I've actually written just a little bit because when you said that, I did a bit of research and learned a little bit about the role of magic in Egyptian society, and it was very interesting. But maybe you could just say a
Yeah,
few words about
because magic is based on spell casting, and everything in Egypt is about knowing the right spell. The dead person has to learn the spells so that when he or she gets into the afterlife, everything is a function of those spells. You can make doors open for you simply by knowing the magic word to make the door open. So spell casting is, yeah, the Egyptians, it's absolutely fundamental. And their texts, when you read them, like reading the pyramid texts, which go all the way back to 2600 BC, they're some of the earliest religious mythological writings in the world. They're very, very hard to read, and they're just full of spells as you're reading them. And you, as a mythologist, you just want to read it for the stories, but there really aren't any in the pyramid text. There are no stories in the pyramid text. Think about that for a second. The oldest religious writings in the world, they're all spells, just spells with lots of gods intermixed from the high mythical consciousness structure that's laid like a stratum on top of a much older magical consciousness structure that's probably been in Africa forever. And probably very strong to this day. The magical structure is probably still very common amongst Aboriginal inhabitants of Africa, probably to this day. And so it becomes very strong in Egypt for that reason. But yet they're inheriting from Mesopotamia all the apparatus of high civilization that just gets laid on top of these ancient funerary cults that do retain their spells because the Egyptians were so conservative. So in a way, it's an oversimplification for Gebser to say, this is mythical, that's magical. In the case of Egypt, it is both, and almost equally so. And almost equally, other than the Mesoamericans, who have a similar kind of balance of magical and mythical as well. Because once you have high civilization, you're definitely in the mythical world in Gebser's sense, where we have gods and the ability to erect temples and monuments and do astronomy and mathematics. That's definitely the realm of mythology and gods, and also Fraser's religion. So that's how I would characterize that.
That's fascinating what you said about the fact that the pyramid texts, they're not stories, they're just spells. They're instructions for funerary rituals.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Now that I'm mentally reviewing the history of Egyptian literature that I know, storytelling doesn't really get going till the Middle Kingdom. So the Old Kingdom has been up and running 1,000 years based on the magical structure and based on spells. And so you will search in vain when you go back to that period looking for stories. They're just not there, really, until there are the autobiographies of the courtiers of Pharaoh. They make little stories about their lives in that sense, but they're not really myths. They're just autobiographical. I did this, I did that, so they'll get merit in the afterlife.
Wait, so the Egyptians did not have stories about their gods in the Old Kingdom?
We can't, I'm sure they did, but we can't find them. They're not. It's just all spells, the tomb inscriptions of the autobiographies of the nobles, and there really isn't anything until the Middle Kingdom when the Egyptians really do invent the short story. They invent it, and it's the secular short story, even though they're told with mythical structures behind them. But they're not stories of gods. They're stories of people encountering gods, like the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, where the guy lands on an island and he encounters a giant magical snake that grants him wishes. So it's a sort of god. But you get stories coming in there as a secular genre in the Middle Kingdom, which is around 2000 BC when that comes up. So yeah, Egypt is up and running for 1,000 years, and that's Spengler's arc of 1,000 years of cultural creativity. Once a civilization comes into being, it's got 1,000 years of cultural creativity, and after that, everything is kind of a stiffening and a petrifaction, as the Middle Kingdom actually is. When you look at their pyramids, they're just mass produced. There's nothing special about them. They're so shoddily done that most of them have fallen apart. We don't really have much in the way of pyramids from the Middle Kingdom that's still standing the way we do at Giza. And the whole culture stiffens up. The art becomes very formal and stiff as well during the Middle Kingdom. They're clearly on the way down, though they're maintaining this sort of status quo, surviving as a sort of petrifact of themselves before the Hyksos come in later on around 1680 or so and put them to the test. But yeah, I'm trying to think of any Egyptian stories prior to the Middle Kingdom. There aren't any that I know, at least not that they wrote down.
Okay, so obviously in The Masks of God, Campbell, he's defining the great domains in the first chapter of the second volume, which is really an introduction to post-primitive mythology. He distinguishes between the Orient and the Occident, which are sort of also outdated terms. And then obviously within the Occident, he distinguishes between Levantine and the West, and then the Orient between China and India. But the point I want to emphasize here is that the distinction between the Orient and the Occident for him does have to do with this cleavage between creator and created, right? So for him, the Oriental world, they don't really, in a sense, distinguish the heavens from the earth as clearly as the Occidentals do. And there's more of a kind of pantheistic view where God is in the creation. He's not separate from the creation. God is in the world. It's a kind of pantheism, I think. Whereas, again, most clearly in the Jewish tradition, you get this very strong separation between God and his creation. And the world is not God. God's creation is not God. It is his creation. So I was just thinking, it's almost like in the Oriental world, that distinction between nature and the heavens is not as clear as it is in the Occidental world, at least according to Campbell, as I understand him.
I get your drift, but I disagree with it because I think that, like in Chinese mythology, there's a very strong emphasis on identifying the gods with the heavens and the stars and the constellations. Like the two earliest creator deities there are Fuxi and Nukwa. Nukwa is the woman, Fuxi is the man, and they have laid down all the rules for mathematics, but also for astronomy as well. And indeed, they even create the heavens. So that's a tough one to agree with. The separation of the world parents, though, does originate with both the Egyptians on the one hand and the Sumerians on the other. But the Sumerian version is probably older, with the separation of the earth goddess Kai from the sky god On by a cosmic mountain. And so there's the basic separation there. And it happens in Egypt too as well, but the genders are reversed. Nut is the sky goddess and or Hathor. I suspect Hathor might actually be the older sky goddess, although she's more of a day god because she has cow's horns and she carries Hathor, as her name indicates, house of Horus. And note that too, she was probably the earlier mother of Horus before Isis came along. Hathor. So she's extremely archaic.
Well, how do you understand Campbell's distinction between Orient and Occident? Like, what do you think he's trying to get at?
He does say, yeah, you're right insofar as when he talks about the Orient, that they have no idea of a fall in that sense, of a Christian fall, and nature being stained with sin and so forth. That doesn't exist. Everything in Chinese mythology, Japanese mythology, is all nature is divine. In Shinto, there are little spirit beings everywhere. But that's true of most of these religions as well. They don't really desanctify the earth just because of the separation of the parents. The earth is still spiritual, just as spiritual as it is in the Middle East, as it is, I think, in Asia as well. When we think of the signatures of the four domains, we think of Lao Tzu and the Buddha for Asia, and then in the West that he gives is Prometheus and Job.
Job, yeah.
Prometheus and Job are kind of, it's interesting because they're both caught in agonic clashes between
with gods. Right.
It's just crunched. That doesn't happen with Lao Tzu and the Buddha.
You and I discussed that before. Like the two embodiments of the Occidental domains, Job and Prometheus, are both the whole story is their relationship with God, right?
Not the case with Lao Tzu and the Buddha. They're in harmony with the flow, with the gods, with nature. Yeah, there's no separation in that sense. So a lot of subtleties here. Nuances.
Yeah, a lot of subtleties. Well, it's probably just worth saying that for Gebser, he's not saying, magical bad, mythical better, mental good. These are inescapable parts of human beings. They're just different strata, and you don't want to repress any of it. You want to kind of integrate it all, and that's what the integral consciousness structure would do. Whereas I think Fraser was more dismissive of magic,
Absolutely.
and supportive of religion, right? He
thought, this interesting, when we look at Fraser for a second here, if I may interrupt, when he's talking about the magic, he's talking about Aboriginals having control over nature with magic, because you can cast the spell, you yourself, if you know the spell, you can cast it and make stuff happen. Whereas the difference with religion is you can no longer do that. You have to send prayers to the gods and hope that they will control things for you. But then he says, with science, we come back to magical, in that we are now back in the driver's seat. We are now controlling nature again. It's just that it's rational now, not irrational, like it was with magic.
I was more familiar with his distinction between magic and religion, where again, magic is you're trying to control nature, but it's based on faulty reasoning. Religious, you're appealing to gods for help. But I did not realize that with science, you go back to controlling nature. It's just now it's not faulty reasoning. Yeah, that's interesting.
That's Fraser.
Yeah. And that is the modern view. I mean, that's the default modern view, right? Yeah. Maybe we could close by just talking a little bit about interesting ways in which all of these consciousness structures get mixed in particular societies. We've already talked a little bit about that, with Egypt being a great example, where you very prominently have this magical substratum, and then you have Bronze Age celestial lights, mythological consciousness structure being kind of grafted onto it almost from the Sumerian influence. So that's one example of an interesting kind of mixture of these things. And again, Gebser favors a mixture. He favors an integration. And Ken Wilber does too, who I know you're not a huge fan of, but he's very influenced by Gebser and thinks that, you need to, it's good to transcend the magical, but you don't want to repress it in the process. You want to include it. Same with the mythical. Okay. So I just wanted to note a few interesting mixtures. And that my only goal here is just to kind of talk about some interesting mixtures. It's nothing more than that. So I'll just mention a few things that occurred to me when I was thinking about this. I know you and I have both seen the show Rome, which is a great show, especially the first season or two. And this was Rome around the time of the shift from the Republic to the Empire. So it's Rome, it's not even initial Rome. So we're well into the mental consciousness structure at this point. And indeed, Rome, in some ways, might be considered almost repressive mental, in the sense that it's not as metaphysical as some of its precursor societies, like, pre-Socratic Athens with Aeschylean tragedy, et cetera. But the point I want to make here is that in the show Rome, so now you're well into the mental consciousness structure, but you've still got a lot of mythological thinking. Like, I think Lucius Varenus, the main character, he's very insistent on propitiating the household gods. And then also there's a scene.
They pray to Mars before they're going to go out to a fight. You see the soldiers invoking Mars first. Okay, good. We checked in with the gods. Let's do this.
Yeah. Right. And also, I can't remember her name, but the spurned lover of Julius Caesar, she tries to curse him. She takes some kind of, it looks like a pencil or like a pen or maybe a charcoal pen, and she sticks it into a black sheet that's roughly like a sheet of paper, and kind of like etches a curse into it against Julius Caesar. That's just pure magical thinking.
But of course, this is also right at the time where Spengler says the second religiousness comes in with the Romans, and I think by that he would include the magical with together with the mythical.
So maybe this wouldn't have happened in like 300 BC or something like that.
Oh, yeah. Maybe not. I mean, those practices have probably been preserved forever, and they're just passed along to her. But once they start sort of, the intelligentsia or the people in charge are no longer just dismissive of that, but they too are going to prophets and oracles and priestesses. Now we're back in the religious mentality proper.
Right. I mean, what I think is interesting are like even before the second religiousness, just the vestiges you see, right?
Like the folklore survivals.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, underneath the culture that's always there, that's preserved by what William Irwin Thompson called nannies and grannies. They carry that on, which is why the Grimm brothers went looking for the nannies and grannies, because they knew those people would remember the ancient folklore and myths.
Well, yeah, and in our society, I mean, there are tarot card readers and psychics on every corner in most cities, right? Yeah. So,
Never going to go away
yeah.
altogether. 100%. It just falls out of the mainstream intelligentsia.
One thing, again, on the subject that you've already referred to in passing is that the magical consciousness structure is probably strongest today in Africa.
For the Caribbean as well, with voodoo
Yeah.
and coming up into New Orleans.
Well,
there's like a culture zone that extends from New Orleans down through the islands, and the islands have also preserved from voodoo cults also the magical structure.
that's what I was going to say, that so Africa and African diasporas. And I was thinking of
right, because they're connected. You're
right.
Right, exactly.
Right. So like Cuba with Santeria, Afro-Brazilians with Candomblé, if you're familiar. I was going to mention Louisiana and New Orleans too. And I was just going to mention True Detective, because I don't know if you remember this, the kind of mythical imagination of the villain. You learn late in the first season that it comes from stories that he heard from his Black nanny. There's this scene when Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson go to visit the villain's old nanny, and Matthew McConaughey shows her all of these images that the villain had come up with and that Matthew McConaughey had drawn. And he shows these images to this nanny who's like senile. And she just completely locks in and goes to this different place that's almost kind of haunting. She knows those images. She taught those images to the villain. That's another interesting example of kind of Louisiana African diaspora magical consciousness structure. In this case, manifesting in a really good TV show. But
it's never really purely the case that one structure, it might predominate as the main one, but it never eliminates these other structures. They never fully go away. Even if they become deficient, like Gebser says, the magical structure becomes deficient when it devolves into black magic. So it's no longer useful as the primary organized, what Quigley, I suppose, would call the instrument of expansion for that society. It no longer works. It's the equivalent of his petrifaction of a decayed institution. The Gebser's idea of it is deficient now. Like he says of the mental consciousness structure, it's deficient now because it's hyper-rational, gone too far into that direction. So there needs to be some way to bring the spiritual back, not to get rid of science. Gebser would never say that, but because when you're reading, especially the second volume of The Ever-Present Origin, he's going through every aspect of the sciences and saying there's no reason why any of this cannot become transparent to the transcendent. Science needs to be more like stained glass rather than using rationalism to build a wall around itself, to wall every form of spirituality out. The architecture of the wall can stay there. It just needs to become transparent, translucent. That's the integral, so that the light, we can see the light coming in through the achievements of science.
Right.
It really has been a battle. The problem of the conflict between science and religion is really the battle between Catholic Christianity and science, and their little dance between, with Copernicus and them. At first, they were sympathetic to Copernicus because they were trying to solve the Julian the calendar. They had lost days on the calendar, so they were initially sympathetic to him. But after the Protestant outbreak, now they're burning Giordano Bruno, threatening to burn Galileo, and then all the way down to in the 19th century, you have one of the big disciples of Darwin is Ernst Haeckel in Germany. He's one of the big German popularizers of Darwin. But Haeckel had it. He really had it in for the Catholic Church, especially the Jesuits, and he was constantly going after them and haranguing them. That really has been the dance, not so much between science and spirituality, but between science and an outmoded Christian cosmology that everybody knows is not the correct cosmology because they didn't have telescopes and microscope. They didn't have the right tools. If they had, Christian cosmology would be very different.
I think a lot of very spiritual people who do a lot of meditation, who do a lot of psychedelic therapy and psychedelic guiding, healing, things like that, they regard the magical realm as like the highest realm and the realm you want to get to in your spiritual journey. And I think that's somewhat consistent with Gebser, because for Gebser, magical is sort of the deepest stratum. You've had these subsequent accretions. So whereas Fraser, it's like magic bad, religion better, science the best. For these guys, it's more like rational not great, mythical better, magical the best. So I just wanted to note that And one other thing that I think might be somewhat related is that Ken Wilber, and maybe Gebser does this too, I don't know, he maps magical, mythical, and mental onto the developmental stages of the human individual. So like a baby is a kind of magical thinker, you know, I want milk, I cry, and the nipple appears, right?
The invisible childhood friend.
Right.
It is a kind of a magical way of looking at the world.
Any thoughts in response to those last two things I said about the psychedelic guides who think magical is the pinnacle, and what I just said about the
I think that Gebser and also Rudolf Steiner, the German mystic who speaks about these things quite a bit and is startlingly compatible with Gebser, they would both say that's a regression. But going back to the magical consciousness structure is not what we want. That's a regression. It's not the kind of spirituality. It's outmoded. We've been there and done that, and the kind of spirituality that we need now. Although Gebser would say we would have respect for the magical, and there would be occasions to use it, because that's the whole point of the integral, is not throwing these structures out, but relativizing them and using them when necessary. So, but I think he would think that that's a regression. Steiner would say the same thing, absolutely, which is why Steiner, despite his clairvoyant abilities, which he did have, nonetheless waved his hand at mediums, seances, astrology, all of that stuff, because he regarded it as sensationalism and also as a regression. We built up the ego, and Steiner, this is his big thing. The West's task was to build up the ego and critical intellectual thinking. Same thing as Gebser's mental consciousness structure. That's been its karmic task, as he puts it. And so we've done that now. And now that it has been done, it's gone as far as it can go, and it needs to become fused with spirituality. Spirituality needs to brighten it up, just as the same thing with Gebser's integral structure. We're trying to get somewhere, and we can't just toss out the ego as the New Age does. And I think he would wave his hand at the New Age as well, as a vulgarization of spirituality. We can't just toss out the ego with its critical faculties, because it was a hard-fought battle in the first place to get to where we're at with it, with clear rational thinking, so we can find out what the true nature of the physical world is. It's just that science thinks it gets arrogant because it has good successes with the physical plane, and it thinks, therefore, that's the only thing that matters. And it doesn't realize that there are other planes, other spiritual planes also. But I think that's going to change. I get a feeling because more and more sort of respectable physicians and scientists, and especially people in the medical community, are slowly opening the door more and more to things like acupuncture.
I've noticed that too.
It works. They're just like, we don't know how it works. Well, it works because there's an etheric body full of meridians, exactly like the Chinese said it was. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. You can poke a needle in it, though, and get a result. So it is there. You just can't see it. The needle can get there. So, and I'm sure there will be other modes. Raymond Moody's near-death experiences, that was only because in the 1970s, the technology for reviving people got better and better. And now it's gotten so much better that we have probably thousands of near-death experiences now on record. Raymond Moody, when he wrote that book in the 70s, Life After Life, had only like 25 or 30 case studies, and he was just coining the term. Respectable man. Brian Weiss was a respectable Yale-trained psychoanalyst who stumbled upon reincarnation when he was putting his patients under hypnosis, and they started remembering lives from places like Egypt, and not I was Cleopatra, but more like I was a little girl living in some shithole village, stuff like that that's more realistic. And he, or John Mack, who, again, one of these guys who studied the phenomenon, the Harvard trained, I think it was Mack's case. So he has to risk his entire career on taking alien abductions seriously. So these guys all put their careers at risk to use science to venture as a tool to venture with them into these jungles of spirituality that most scientists would just put a wall in front of and say, out there is beyond the pale. These guys want to go out there and take science as an instrument with them. And they're getting very good results. And I see that science will probably do more and more of this as it goes along, starting to bring spiritual energies, etheric energies into the field so that we can take them seriously and learn about them rather than just dismiss them, because we know they're there.
Right. Yeah. It's a great it's a great point about acupuncture. Every passing month, I see more people taking it seriously.
Yep.
And another good example is obviously the medical interest in psychedelics. I think
that's coming more and more. That's being taken more and more seriously as well.
I mean,
Absolutely.
The big term is integration, right? You don't want to repress the previous stages, and you don't want to repress the new stages. You want to integrate them all together. I think that's really
I think that's our task right now.
Yeah.
Is integral in
Yeah.
integrating these things.
Well, John, this has been great.
Okay, awesome, Brandon. Thank you for having me on.
It's always great to have you, John. It's always a privilege.
Likewise, Brandon. All right, take care. Let me know when the next one.